Picture this. You're a Roman senator in the year 40 AD, dressed in your finest toga, walking through the marble corridors of the Senate House. The morning sun filters through the columns as you prepare for another day of governing the most powerful empire the world has ever known. You spent years climbing the political ladder, making alliances, delivering speeches, all for the chance to serve Rome's greatest interests. Then, you receive the most shocking news of your career. The emperor has just announced his intention to appoint his horse to the consulship, the highest political office in the Roman Republic, the position you've dreamed of holding your entire life. You stand there, mouth agape, watching as servants lead a magnificent stallion through the very halls where Cicero once debated and Caesar once walked. The horse is draped in purple silk, the color reserved for royalty, its mane braided with gold, its hooves painted with precious oils. This isn't a fever dream or some elaborate joke. This is your reality, under Emperor Caligula, a man whose name has become synonymous with madness, excess, and the complete breakdown of political order. But here's what will shock you even more. The story you think you know about Caligula marrying his horse is almost certainly false. Yet, the truth is somehow even more disturbing than the legend. Before diving into this incredible story of power, politics, and the thin line between genius and madness, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you understand one of history's most infamous emperors, and show you how a single story, repeated for nearly 2,000 years, can obscure a far more complex and fascinating truth. The tale of Caligula and his beloved horse Incitatus isn't just about imperial madness, it's about political satire, institutional corruption, and the dangerous game of absolute power that still plays out in governments around the world today. The year was 37 AD, when Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, became emperor of Rome at the tender age of 24. The nickname itself tells you everything you need to know about his unusual path to power. Caligula means little boots, a name given to him as a child when he wore miniature military sandals while accompanying his father Germanicus on campaigns along the Rhine frontier. Imagine being that child, growing up in military camps, surrounded by hardened soldiers who treated you like a mascot, never knowing the stability of a normal childhood. Your father is one of Rome's most popular generals. Great-great-grandfather is Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and your entire family tree is soaked in the blood of civil wars and political assassinations. This was Caligula's world, a place where trust was a luxury nobody could afford, and paranoia was a survival skill.
When Caligula first took power, the Roman people rejoiced. His predecessor, Tiberius, had been a grim, suspicious old man who spent his final years in self-imposed exile on the island of Capri, ruling through fear and terror. Caligula represented hope, young, charismatic, connected to the beloved Germanicus, and seemingly eager to restore the glory days of his great-great-grandfather Augustus. The early months of his reign seemed to confirm these hopes. Caligula recalled political exiles, distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the people of Rome, and staged magnificent gladiatorial games that made him wildly popular with the masses. He appeared to be everything Rome needed, a young, energetic leader who could bridge the gap between the old republican traditions and the new imperial reality. But then, something changed. Whether it was a severe illness that affected his mind, the intoxicating effects of absolute power, or simply the revelation of a personality that had always been lurking beneath the surface, Caligula began to display behavior that shocked even the jaded Roman elite, and at the center of this transformation was a horse named Incitatus. Incitatus, the name means swift or at full gallop, was no ordinary horse. This magnificent stallion became the focus of Caligula's attention in ways that defied every tradition of Roman society. According to the historian Suetonius, writing some 80 years after Caligula's death, the emperor lavished upon this animal luxuries that would have made senators jealous. Picture walking into Incitatus's stable, if you could even call it that. Instead of the typical wooden stalls where even the finest horses were kept, you'd find marble walls polished to mirror brightness. The floor wasn't covered with straw, but with the finest carpets imported from the far reaches of the empire. The feeding trough wasn't wood or clay, but carved ivory, inlaid with precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. The horse wore a collar made of precious gems, sapphires, emeralds, and pearls that cost more than most Romans would see in a lifetime. His blankets were dyed the imperial purple, a color so exclusive that wearing it without permission was punishable by death. Servants, not stable boys, but actual servants, attended to the animal's every need, brushing his coat with silver combs and feeding him oats mixed with flakes of real gold. But the material luxury was only the beginning. Caligula treated Incitatus not just as a prized possession, but as a member of the imperial court. The horse had his own house, complete with furniture and a full staff of servants. Dignitaries were invited to dine with
Incitatus sitting at tables, while the horse stood nearby, presumably being served alongside the human guests.
The emperor would toast, the animals held their banquets, raising his wine cup in elaborate ceremonies that must have left foreign ambassadors questioning their own sanity.
Caligula reportedly slept in the horse's stable before important races, claiming he needed to ensure that no one would disturb the animal's rest. Guards were posted with orders to kill anyone who made noise that might interrupt the horse's sleep. These weren't private eccentricities hidden away from public view. Caligula flaunted his relationship with Incitatus, making it a centerpiece of court life. He appointed priests to serve the horse, created elaborate rituals around the animal's care, and spoke of Incitatus as if the creature were a trusted advisor whose opinions mattered in matters of state. The culmination of this bizarre relationship came when Caligula announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the highest political office in Rome, a position that had been held by heroes like Cicero and statesmen who had shaped the destiny of nations. The consulship wasn't just a title, it was the pinnacle of a Roman political career, representing years of service, wisdom, and the trust of the people. To understand the shock this announcement created, you need to grasp what the consulship meant to Roman society. These weren't just ceremonial positions handed out to cronies and flatterers. Consuls were expected to lead armies, propose legislation, conduct diplomacy, and serve as the living embodiment of Roman virtue and capability. The idea that this sacred office might be given to a horse wasn't just insulting, it was a fundamental attack on everything that made Rome great. But here's where the story gets even more complex and fascinating. Modern historians have begun to question whether Caligula's behavior toward Incitatus was really the product of madness, or whether something far more calculated and political was at work. The clues are hidden in the details that ancient writers recorded, thinking they were simply documenting the ravings of a lunatic emperor. Consider the timing of Caligula's most outrageous pronouncements about his horse. They came during periods of intense conflict with the Roman Senate, the traditional governing body that had ruled Rome for centuries before the rise of the emperors. These senators, many of them from ancient families that traced their lineage back to the founding of the Republic, deeply resented the power that emperors had taken from their institution. Caligula, young and inexperienced in the delicate art of managing senatorial egos, found himself in constant conflict with these proud, ambitious men. They criticized his spending, questioned his policies, and made it clear that they viewed him as an upstart who had inherited power he didn't deserve. The tension in the Senate House was so thick you could cut it with a gladius. It was in this atmosphere of mutual hostility that Caligula began making his most provocative statements about Incitatus. When senators complained about his appointments to important positions, he would respond by praising his horse's qualifications for high office. When they questioned his judgment in matters of state, he would suggest that Incitatus possessed wisdom that surpassed theirs. The brilliant cruelty of this approach becomes clear when you consider it from Caligula's perspective. He was telling the senators in the most humiliating way possible that their cherished positions and ancient privileges meant so little to him that he considered a horse equally qualified for their jobs. Every luxury he lavished on Incitatus was a pointed reminder that he valued his animal more than he valued them. The name Incitatus itself may have been part of this elaborate insult. One modern historian has suggested that the name was chosen as a deliberate slight against a specific consul named Asinius Celer, whose surname meant Swift. By naming his horse Swift and threatening to make the animal a consul, Caligula may have been making a sophisticated joke that only the most educated Romans would fully appreciate, calling his target a swift ass in the most public and humiliating way possible. This interpretation transforms our understanding of Caligula from a simple madman into something far more dangerous, a calculating political operator who used apparent insanity as a weapon against his enemies. The luxuries he gave his horse weren't signs of mental illness, but carefully orchestrated theater designed to demonstrate his contempt for traditional Roman values and institutions. Think about it from the perspective of a senator witnessing these events. You've spent decades building your career, cultivating relationships, studying law and rhetoric, all to earn the respect that comes with high office. Then, this young emperor, who gained power through inheritance rather than merit, makes it clear that he considers you less valuable than his pet horse. The psychological impact would be devastating, designed to break your spirit and reduce you to a sycophant, desperate for imperial approval. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more complex and tragic. The very sources that tell us about Incitatus, historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, were writing decades, or even centuries, after Caligula's death, during periods when it was politically advantageous to portray earlier emperors as monsters and madmen. These historians lived under different imperial dynasties that benefited from discrediting the Julio-Claudian line to which Caligula belonged. By portraying him as insane and depraved, they legitimized the reigns of later emperors who had seized power. Comparison. This means that every detail we have about Incitatus comes through a filter of political propaganda and sensationalist storytelling, designed to entertain readers and advance political agendas. The historians who recorded these tales were like ancient tabloid writers, more interested in scandal than truth, more concerned with dramatic effect than historical accuracy. So what really happened between Caligula and his famous horse? The answer lies buried beneath layers of political manipulation, ancient gossip, and 2,000 years of misunderstanding. To find the truth, we need to examine not just what the sources tell us, but why they chose to tell us these particular stories in these particular ways. The first crucial fact that destroys the popular narrative is this: Caligula never actually married his horse. This detail, repeated in countless books, movies, and internet articles, appears nowhere in any ancient source. It's a modern invention, probably born from the natural human tendency to make already shocking stories even more sensational. When people heard that a Roman emperor had treated his horse like a member of the royal family, someone, somewhere, decided that marriage was the logical next step in the story. But the absence of this detail from ancient sources reveals something important about how historical myths develop. Each generation that retells a story adds their own embellishments, their own interpretations, their own cultural assumptions. What started as a political satire about imperial power and senatorial weakness became a tale of sexual deviance and absolute madness. The transformation tells us more about the people telling the story than about the events they claim to describe. Even more significantly, the ancient sources are unanimous on another crucial point. Incitatus was never actually made a consul. Both Suetonius and Cassius Dio are careful to use language that indicates intention rather than action. Suetonius writes that Caligula designated the horse for the consulship, while Dio says he promised to make the appointment and would most certainly have done this if he had lived longer. This distinction between planning and execution reveals the true nature of Caligula's political theater. He wasn't actually destroying Roman institutions. He was threatening to destroy them, wielding the possibility of institutional collapse as a weapon against his enemies. The senators lived in constant fear not of what Caligula had done, but of what he might do next. This psychological torture was far more effective than any actual appointment could have been. Consider the genius of this approach. If Caligula had actually appointed his horse as consul, the crisis would have been immediate but finite. The Senate could have rebelled, the Praetorian Guard might have intervened, and the political system would have found some way to resolve the situation. But by keeping the threat perpetually hanging over their heads, Caligula maintained maximum leverage, with minimum risk. Every day the senators went to work, they faced the possibility that this might be the day their most cherished institution would be handed over to a four-legged creature that couldn't even understand human speech. The uncertainty was maddening, and that was exactly the point. Caligula had turned the entire Roman government into his personal psychological experiment, with himself as the mad scientist and the senators as his unwilling test subjects. The horse racing culture of ancient Rome provides another crucial piece of context that's often overlooked in modern retellings. Romans were absolutely obsessed with chariot racing, in a way that's difficult for us to comprehend today. Imagine if modern professional sports, reality television, and political campaigns were all rolled into one massive spectacle that consumed the attention of an entire civilization. That was chariot racing in ancient Rome. The races held at the Circus Maximus could accommodate over 250,000 spectators, nearly a quarter of Rome's entire population. People bet enormous sums on their favorite teams, riots erupted over disputed results, and successful charioteers became celebrities whose fame rivaled that of emperors. The four racing factions, the Blues, Greens, Reds, and Whites, developed followings so passionate that they resembled modern political parties more than sports teams. In this environment, owning a successful racing horse was the ultimate status symbol. Wealthy Romans spent fortunes on breeding programs, training facilities, and the care of their prize animals. A horse that could win consistently at the Circus Maximus was worth more than most senators' entire estates. When viewed in this context, Caligula's lavish treatment of Incitatus seems less like insanity and more like the behavior of a young man with unlimited resources and a passion for the sport that defined Roman popular culture. But Caligula took this normal Roman obsession and weaponized it for political purposes. By treating his racing horse with more respect and luxury than he showed to senators, he was making a statement about his priorities that every Roman would understand. He was saying that entertainment mattered more to him than governance, that spectacle trumped statecraft, that he would rather invest in his personal pleasures than in the institutions that had made Rome great. This message resonated far beyond the walls of the Senate House. Ordinary Romans, struggling with poverty and unemployment, while their emperor spent fortunes on a single horse, began to understand that Caligula's priorities were fundamentally different from those of previous rulers. The emperor, who had once distributed generous bonuses and staged magnificent games for the people, was now using those same resources to indulge his private obsessions. The religious dimensions of Incitatus's treatment add another layer of complexity to this story. Caligula didn't just give his horse material luxuries. He appointed priests to serve the animal, created elaborate rituals around its care, and spoke of it in terms that bordered on the divine. In a society where the line between politics and religion was already blurred, this elevation of a horse to quasi-divine status represented a fundamental challenge to traditional Roman values. Roman religion was deeply conservative, built around ancient rituals and time-tested traditions that connected the present generation to their ancestors. The gods were serious beings who demanded respect, proper ceremonies, and adherence to established customs. By creating a religious cult around his horse, Caligula was essentially declaring that he could invent new forms of worship whenever he pleased. That divine favor could be bestowed on anyone or anything he chose, regardless of tradition or precedent. This religious innovation was perhaps even more threatening to conservative Romans than the political implications of the consulship threat. Politics could be reformed, institutions could be restructured, but religion touched the very core of what it meant to be Roman. When Caligula elevated his horse to semi-divine status, he was attacking not just the political order, but the spiritual foundation of Roman civilization itself. The psychological profile that emerges from this analysis is of a young man drunk on power, but also profoundly isolated and paranoid. Caligula had grown up in a world where family members routinely murdered each other for political advantage, where friends could become enemies overnight, where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. His relationship with Incitatus may have represented the only genuine emotional connection he felt capable of maintaining. Think about it from his perspective. Senators flattered him to his face while plotting against him in private. Courtiers agreed with everything he said while secretly mocking him behind his back. Foreign ambassadors praised his wisdom while reporting his weaknesses to their own governments. But his horse had no hidden agenda, no secret ambitions, no capacity for betrayal. In a world full of human predators, Incitatus represented the only relationship that Caligula could trust completely. This emotional dimension doesn't excuse Caligula's behavior, but it helps explain it. The young emperor who had seemed so promising in his early months had been corrupted, not just by power, but by the isolation that power created. Cut off from normal human relationships by the demands of his position, he formed an obsessive attachment to the one being in his life that couldn't hurt him. The fact that this being was a horse rather than a person reveals the tragic depths of his psychological damage. The story of Incitatus also illuminates the broader problem of succession in imperial Rome. Unlike modern democracies with established procedures for transferring power, or traditional monarchies with clear rules of inheritance, the Roman Empire had no systematic way of choosing new emperors. Each succession was a potential crisis that could plunge the entire Mediterranean world into civil war. Caligula himself had come to power largely by accident. He wasn't the obvious heir to Tiberius, wasn't particularly well prepared for leadership, and had no real experience in the complex art of imperial governance. He was chosen partly because other potential successors had been eliminated through political violence, partly because his connection to the popular Germanicus made him acceptable to the army, and partly because the alternatives seemed even worse. This haphazard system of succession meant that the empire could find itself ruled by individuals who were completely unsuited for the responsibilities they inherited. Caligula's youth, inexperience, and psychological instability made him a particularly dangerous example of this systemic problem. His threats to make his horse a consul weren't just personal eccentricity, they were a symptom of a political system that could place unlimited power in the hands of someone utterly unqualified to wield it. The senators who watched in horror as Caligula elevated his horse understood that they were witnessing not just the breakdown of one man's sanity, but the failure of the entire imperial system. If an emperor could seriously consider appointing a horse to the highest political office in Rome, what did that say about the nature of imperial power itself? What did it reveal about the institutions they had spent their lives serving? These questions became even more urgent when we consider what happened to Incitatus after Caligula's assassination in 41 AD. The horse simply disappears from the historical record, vanishing as completely as if he had never existed. No ancient source tells us what became of this animal that had once been the center of imperial attention, that had lived in luxury rivaling that of princes, that had supposedly been destined for the consulship. This disappearance is itself telling. When Caligula died, his successors moved quickly to erase all traces of his more controversial innovations. The horse that had once dined with senators and slept in marble stalls was quietly retired to obscurity, his fate considered too unimportant to record. The very speed with which Incitatus vanished from public life suggests that his elevation had been entirely dependent on one man's whim, rather than any genuine political or religious significance. The silence surrounding Incitatus's fate after Caligula's death speaks to a deeper truth about the nature of imperial power and the fragility of the institutions that supported it. When absolute authority rests in the hands of a single individual, the entire structure of government becomes vulnerable to that person's whims, obsessions, and psychological state. What seemed like permanent changes to the Roman system, the elevation of a horse to the near-divine status, the threat to traditional political offices, could be swept away overnight when new leadership emerged. But the damage had already been done. The senators who had lived through Caligula's reign carried with them the memory of how quickly their most sacred institutions could be reduced to objects of mockery. They had seen firsthand how an emperor could use apparent madness as a weapon, wielding the threat of chaos to maintain control over a government that was supposed to represent centuries of accumulated wisdom and tradition. This psychological scarring had profound implications for how future emperors would relate to the Senate and other traditional Roman institutions. Claudius, who succeeded Caligula, spent much of his reign trying to restore dignity to offices that his predecessor had systematically degraded. But the precedent had been set. Every senator now understood that their positions, their authority, even their basic human dignity, existed only at the pleasure of whoever happened to wear the purple. The transformation of this historical episode into legend reveals something equally fascinating about how societies process traumatic political experiences. The story of Caligula and his horse became a kind of cultural shorthand for governmental dysfunction, a way of expressing complex anxieties about power and corruption through a simple, memorable narrative. Over the centuries, each generation that retold the story added their own interpretations and embellishments. Medieval chroniclers, living under very different political systems, emphasized the religious dimensions of Caligula's behavior. Renaissance writers, fascinated by the psychology of power, focused on the emperor's supposed madness. Enlightenment thinkers use the story to critique absolute monarchy, while modern commentators have turned it into a metaphor for everything from political nepotism to the celebrity culture that dominates contemporary society. The enduring power of the Incitatus story lies in its perfect encapsulation of universal fears about leadership and governance. Every society worries about what happens when unqualified people gain access to positions of authority. Every political system struggles with the balance between necessary hierarchy and dangerous concentration of power. The image of a horse being elevated to high office captures these anxieties in a way that transcends specific historical contexts or cultural boundaries. Consider how the story resonates in our own time. When modern politicians appoint unqualified cronies to important positions, critics inevitably invoke Caligula's horse. When democratic institutions seem to be functioning more as theater than as genuine governance, commentators reach for the same historical parallel. The specific details may be different. We're not literally threatening to appoint animals to cabinet positions, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar. This parallel becomes even more striking when we examine how modern political leaders use spectacle and provocation to maintain control over their opponents and the media. Just as Caligula kept the Roman Senate in a state of constant uncertainty about what he might do next, contemporary politicians often benefit from creating an atmosphere of unpredictability that keeps their enemies off balance and their supporters entertained. The psychological techniques that made Caligula's horse strategy so effective, the deliberate blurring of the line between serious policy and theatrical performance, the use of apparently irrational behavior to demonstrate power, the exploitation of institutional respect as a weapon against those institutions, can be observed in political systems around the world today. The specific methods may have evolved, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. What makes this historical parallel particularly disturbing is how it reveals the fragility of the norms and traditions that hold democratic societies together. Just as Roman senators discovered that their ancient privileges could be reduced to objects of mockery by a single determined individual, modern democratic institutions face similar vulnerabilities when confronted by leaders who are willing to break unwritten rules for political advantage. The Romans had convinced themselves that their system was too strong, too deeply rooted in tradition, too fundamental to their identity to be seriously threatened by one man's eccentricities. The Senate had survived the rise and fall of kings, had weathered civil wars and foreign invasions, had adapted to the transition from republic to empire. Surely it could withstand the temporary madness of a single emperor. But institutions, no matter how ancient or revered, exist only as long as the people within them continue to believe in their importance and act accordingly. When Caligula demonstrated that he could treat the consulship as a joke, he wasn't just insulting individual senators, he was revealing that the entire system depended on a shared commitment to certain basic assumptions about dignity, qualifications, and proper procedure. Once those assumptions were shattered, they could never be fully restored. Even after Caligula's death, even after more competent emperors took the throne, the memory lingered. Every senator knew that what had happened once could happen again. The precedent had been established that imperial power could be used to humiliate and degrade the very institutions that gave Roman government its legitimacy. The genius of Caligula's approach, if we can call it genius, lay in how it exploited the gap between formal power structures and informal social contracts. Technically, emperors had always possessed the authority to make whatever appointments they chose. The position was, after all, essentially a military dictatorship dressed up in constitutional language. But previous emperors had generally respected the unwritten, the rules that made the system tolerable for everyone involved. Augustus, the first emperor, had been particularly careful to maintain the fiction that he was merely the first among equals, that the Senate retained real authority, that traditional Roman values were being preserved rather than destroyed. His successors, even the unpopular ones like Tiberius, had generally continued this diplomatic approach. They might ignore the Senate's advice, they might make unpopular decisions, but they rarely went out of their way to humiliate the institution itself. Caligula shattered this delicate balance. By threatening to appoint his horse to the consulship, he was essentially announcing that he no longer felt bound by the informal agreements that had made imperial rule acceptable to the traditional Roman elite. He was declaring open war on the entire concept of institutional dignity, using his legal authority to destroy the social consensus that made that authority sustainable. The horse became a symbol of this breakdown, but it was never really about the horse. It was about power, respect, and the question of whether any individual should possess the authority to single-handedly redefine the basic assumptions of how a society governs itself. Caligula's answer was clearly yes, and he was willing to use the most shocking methods possible to demonstrate that position. The Roman senators who witnessed this spectacle found themselves in an impossible situation. They could rebel against the emperor, risking civil war and the destruction of everything they claimed to value. They could submit to his humiliations, thereby legitimizing the very behavior they found so offensive. Or they could try to find some middle ground, some way of preserving their dignity while avoiding direct confrontation. Most chose the third option, which meant participating in the elaborate charade that Caligula had created. They attended banquets where a horse was treated as an honored guest. They listened to speeches praising the animal's qualifications for high office. They watched as their most cherished traditions were systematically mocked and degraded, all while maintaining the polite fiction that this was normal imperial behavior. This psychological torture was perhaps more devastating than any physical punishment could have been. Caligula had found a way to break his opponent's spirits without actually harming their bodies, to demonstrate his power without triggering the kind of violent resistance that might have threatened his position. He had turned the entire Roman government into a theater of humiliation, with himself as director and the senators as unwilling actors in a play they despised. The long-term consequences of this approach extended far beyond Caligula's brief reign. Future emperors inherited a political system that had been fundamentally damaged by his innovations. The relationship between imperial authority and senatorial dignity never fully recovered from the trauma of the horse episodes. What had once been a partnership based on mutual respect, however strained, became a naked power relationship. where everyone understood that institutional traditions could be discarded whenever they became inconvenient. This transformation helps explain why the Roman Empire, despite its military strength and economic prosperity, became increasingly unstable over the following centuries. When the basic legitimacy of governmental institutions is undermined, when the people responsible for making the system work lose faith in its fundamental premises, the entire structure becomes vulnerable to external shocks and internal conflicts that a healthier political system might have weathered. The story of Incitatus thus becomes more than just an amusing anecdote about an eccentric emperor and his beloved pet. It becomes a case study in how individual psychological pathology can interact with structural political weaknesses to create systemic dysfunction that persists long after the original perpetrator has left the scene. The horse disappears from history, but the damage to Roman political culture proved irreversible. Modern scholars who study this period often focus on the more dramatic aspects of Caligula's reign: the military campaigns, the building projects, the assassinations and executions. But the Incitatus episode may have been more historically significant than any of these more conventional expressions of imperial power. By using his horse to systematically humiliate the Senate, Caligula established precedents that would haunt Roman politics for generations. The techniques he pioneered, the strategic use of apparent irrationality, the exploitation of institutional respect as a weapon, the creation of deliberately uncomfortable situations that forced opponents to choose between dignity and safety, became part of the standard imperial toolkit. Later emperors might not threaten to appoint horses to high office, but they found other ways to demonstrate that traditional limitations on their authority were essentially meaningless. This evolution reveals something profound about the nature of political power and the institutions designed to constrain it. Constitutional systems, whether ancient or modern, depend ultimately on the willingness of those in power to accept certain limitations on their authority. When leaders decide that these limitations are inconvenient obstacles rather than essential safeguards, the entire system becomes vulnerable to the kind of systematic degradation that Caligula pioneered. The transformation of the Incitatus story from historical fact to political metaphor reflects this broader pattern. Each generation that encounters the tale sees in it a reflection of their own anxieties about power and governance. The specific details may change, but the underlying fears remain constant. What happens when leaders stop respecting the institutions they're supposed to serve? How do societies respond when the normal rules of political behavior are discarded? What are the long-term consequences when spectacle replaces substance in governmental affairs? These questions are as relevant today as they were in ancient Rome. The technologies may be different, the specific institutions may have evolved, but the basic dynamics of power and resistance remain unchanged. The story of an emperor and his horse continues to resonate because it captures something essential about the eternal tension between authority and accountability, between individual will and collective governance. The final irony of the Incitatus episode is that it may have achieved exactly the opposite of what Caligula intended. Rather than demonstrating his absolute power over Roman institutions, his behavior revealed the fundamental weakness of those institutions by showing how easily traditional forms of authority could be mocked and degraded. He inadvertently provided a roadmap for future challenges to imperial legitimacy. The senators who endured Caligula's humiliations learned lessons that they would apply when dealing with subsequent emperors. They understood now that their survival depended not on the strength of their institutions, but on their ability to adapt to whatever psychological games their rulers chose to play. This knowledge made them both more resilient and more cynical, better able to navigate imperial whims, but less committed to the principles that had once given their positions meaning. When Caligula was finally assassinated in 41 AD, the conspirators weren't just eliminating a problematic emperor. They were attempting to restore a political system that had been fundamentally altered by his innovations. But some changes once made cannot be undone. The memory of how quickly and completely traditional authority could be undermined remained embedded in Roman political culture, creating a permanent source of instability that would contribute to the empire's eventual decline. The horse that had unwittingly participated in this transformation vanished from history as quickly and completely as it had emerged. But the precedents established in its name would echo through the centuries, influencing how power was exercised and resisted in the Roman Empire and beyond. Sometimes the most significant historical changes come not from grand proclamations or dramatic battles, but from seemingly absurd gestures that reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of authority itself. The conspiracy that ended Caligula's life began not in the marble halls of the Senate.
Chaerea, the Praetorian tribune who would deliver the fatal blow, had endured months of deliberate humiliation at Caligula's hands. The emperor delighted in giving him passwords like Venus or Priapus, sexual references designed to mock the grizzled soldier's masculinity. When Chaerea came to receive the daily watchword, Caligula would extend his hand in obscene gestures, forcing the veteran to kiss rings while being subjected to juvenile sexual innuendo. But it wasn't just personal humiliation that drove the conspirators. They had watched Caligula's treatment of Incitatus evolve from eccentric pet ownership into something far more sinister, a systematic assault on every institution that made Roman civilization possible. When the emperor began seriously discussing the horse's qualifications for the consulship, when he appointed priests to serve an animal, when he created elaborate religious ceremonies around a creature that couldn't even understand human speech, the Praetorians understood they were witnessing the complete breakdown of rational government. The final straw came during the Palatine Games in January of 41 AD. Caligula had been performing on stage, itself a shocking breach of imperial dignity, when someone made a joke about his performance. The emperor's reaction was swift and brutal. He ordered the immediate execution of several spectators, claiming they had insulted his artistic abilities. But what horrified the Praetorians wasn't the violence itself. They were accustomed to imperial brutality. It was the randomness, the complete disconnection from any rational system of justice or governance. As Caligula raged about imaginary insults to his theatrical talents, witnesses reported that he turned to Incitatus, who was present at the games in his customary place of honor, and began asking the horse's opinion about which spectators deserved to die. He nodded as if receiving responses, then issued execution orders based on these imaginary consultations with his animal advisor. The line between political theater and genuine madness had finally been crossed. Chaerea and his fellow conspirators realized they were no longer serving a rational human being, but something far more dangerous, a creature of unlimited power whose decision-making process had become entirely divorced from reality. When an emperor starts consulting his horse about life and death matters affecting Roman citizens, the very concept of legitimate government ceases to exist. The assassination itself was swift and brutal. On January 24, 41 AD, as Caligula left the Palatine Games through an underground corridor, Chaerea struck him down with his sword. Other conspirators joined in, hacking at the emperor's body with a fury that spoke to years of accumulated rage and humiliation. They didn't stop with Caligula himself. They also murdered his wife Cassonia and their infant daughter, eliminating any possibility of dynastic continuation. But what happened next reveals the true significance of the Incitatus episode in Roman political development. The conspirators had killed the emperor, but they had no plan for what came after. The Senate, which might have been expected to reassert its authority in the power vacuum, proved incapable of decisive action. Years of psychological warfare had left them broken, uncertain, unable to function as the governing body they had once been. Instead, it was the Praetorian Guard, the same military unit that had produced Caligula's assassins, that determined the succession. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified that the purge would extend to other family members. Rather than killing him, they proclaimed him emperor on the spot, understanding that the empire needed a ruler immediately to prevent complete collapse. This transfer of power marked a fundamental shift in Roman governance. For the first time, the army had directly chosen an emperor without any pretense of senatorial involvement or constitutional process. The precedent established by Caligula's psychological destruction of traditional institutions had created a vacuum that could only be filled by naked military force. The horse that had once threatened to become consul had inadvertently helped transform Rome from a constitutional monarchy into a military dictatorship. Claudius, the stammering scholar who suddenly found himself emperor, understood immediately what needed to be done. His first acts were designed to restore dignity and functionality to the institutions that Caligula had systematically degraded. He canceled the horse's pending appointment to the consulship, disbanded the elaborate priestly cult that had been created to serve Incitatus, and quietly retired the animal to a normal stable with ordinary accommodations. But the damage couldn't be entirely undone. The senators who had been forced to dine with a horse, who had listened to speeches praising an animal's qualifications for high office, who had participated in religious ceremonies honoring a creature that couldn't comprehend the rituals being performed in its name, carried permanent psychological scars. They had learned that their most sacred traditions could be reduced to farce by a single determined individual. And this knowledge fundamentally altered their relationship with imperial authority. Claudius spent much of his 13-year reign trying to rebuild the partnership between emperor and senate that Augustus had originally established. He consulted with senators on important decisions, restored dignity to traditional ceremonies, and generally behaved like a rational adult rather than a theatrical madman. But the relationship could never return to its original form. Everyone understood now that imperial power was essentially unlimited, that constitutional traditions existed only at the emperor's pleasure, that the entire system could be transformed overnight if a ruler chose to exercise his theoretical authority to its fullest extent.
The transformation was subtle but profound. Senators became more deferential, more careful in their criticism, more willing to accommodate imperial whims, rather than risk the kind of systematic humiliation that Caligula had perfected. The institution survived, but its character had been fundamentally altered.
What had once been a partnership based on mutual respect became a performance designed to maintain the fiction of shared governance, while everyone understood the reality of absolute power.
This change had cascading effects throughout Roman society. If the Senate, with all its ancient prestige and constitutional authority, could be reduced to powerlessness by imperial whim, what protection did ordinary citizens have?
The legal system, the administrative bureaucracy, the military command structure, all of these institutions existed within the same framework of theoretically unlimited imperial authority that Caligula had exploited so effectively.
The genius of Augustus's original settlement had been its careful balance between imperial efficiency and republican tradition. He had wielded enormous power while maintaining the forms and ceremonies that made that power acceptable to traditional Roman elites. His successors had generally continued this diplomatic approach, understanding that the system's stability depended on everyone's willingness to participate in a complex political fiction. Caligula had shattered this delicate balance, not through military conquest or constitutional reform, but through psychological warfare that revealed the fiction's fundamental weakness. Once everyone understood that imperial power was essentially unlimited, that traditional constraints existed only as long as the emperor chose to respect them, the entire system became vulnerable to future manipulation by anyone clever enough to exploit these insights.
The techniques Caligula pioneered, using apparent irrationality as a political weapon, exploiting institutional respect to humiliate opponents, creating deliberately uncomfortable situations that forced difficult choices between dignity and survival, became part of the imperial toolkit. Future emperors might not threaten to appoint horses to high office, but they found other ways to demonstrate their freedom from traditional limitations.
Nero would force senators to applaud his theatrical performances. Domitian would demand to be addressed as master and god. Commodus would fight as a gladiator in the Colosseum, forcing the Senate to watch their emperor engage in activities considered beneath the dignity of ordinary citizens, let alone the ruler of the world. Each of these innovations built on precedents that Caligula had established through his relationship with Incitatus. The horse itself disappeared from history as completely as if it had never existed. No ancient source records what happened to the animal after Claudius's succession. It
Probably lived out its days in comfortable obscurity, unaware that it had played a central role in one of history's most significant political transformations. The creature that had once dined with senators and slept in marble stalls became just another horse, its brief moment of imperial favor forgotten as quickly as it had been granted. But the precedents established in Incitatus's name proved more durable than the animal itself. The Roman Empire never fully recovered from the institutional damage that Caligula inflicted. The relationship between emperors and traditional governing bodies remained permanently altered, creating instabilities that would contribute to the empire's eventual collapse centuries later. Modern political scientists studying the fall of the Roman Empire often focus on economic factors, military pressures, or administrative challenges, but the psychological dimension revealed by the Incitatus episode may have been equally important. Once the basic legitimacy of governmental institutions is undermined, once the people responsible for making the system work lose faith in its fundamental premises, even the most powerful states become vulnerable to internal collapse. The transformation of this historical episode into enduring political metaphor reflects its deeper significance. When modern commentators invoke Caligula's horse, they're not just referencing an amusing anecdote about imperial excess. They're drawing on a story that captures something essential about the relationship between power and institutions, between individual authority and collective governance. The metaphor works because it illustrates how quickly institutional dignity can be destroyed when leaders decide that traditional limitations are inconvenient obstacles. Just as Caligula used his horse to demonstrate contempt for senatorial authority, modern politicians sometimes use deliberately provocative appointments or policies to signal their freedom from conventional constraints. The psychological mechanisms remain unchanged across different historical periods and political systems. The deliberate creation of uncomfortable situations, the exploitation of institutional respect as a weapon, the use of apparent irrationality to keep opponents off balance. These techniques transcend specific cultural contexts because they tap into universal human responses to authority and humiliation. What makes the Incitatus story particularly relevant to contemporary politics is how it illustrates the fragility of democratic norms and institutions. Just as Roman senators discovered that their ancient privileges could be reduced to objects of mockery, Modern democratic societies face similar vulnerabilities when confronted by leaders willing to break unwritten rules for political advantage. The Romans had convinced themselves that their system was too deeply rooted in tradition to be seriously threatened by one individual's eccentricities. They believed that
Centuries of accumulated wisdom and institutional development provided sufficient protection against temporary aberrations in leadership. But institutions, no matter how ancient or revered, exist only as long as the people within them continue to believe in their importance and act accordingly. This lesson resonates powerfully in an era when traditional political norms are being challenged around the world. The specific methods may have evolved, or not literally threatening to appoint animals to cabinet positions, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar. The strategic use of spectacle to distract from substantive issues, the deliberate blurring of lines between governance and entertainment, the exploitation of media attention as a tool for maintaining political control, all of these techniques can be traced back to innovations that Caligula pioneered through his relationship with his horse. The enduring power of the story lies in its perfect encapsulation of anxieties that transcend specific historical contexts. Every society worries about what happens when unqualified people gain access to positions of authority. Every political system struggles with the balance between necessary hierarchy and dangerous concentration of power. The image of a horse being elevated to high office captures these concerns in a way that speaks to fundamental human fears about leadership and governance. But the story also offers hope in a perverse way. Caligula's reign, despite its psychological innovations and institutional damage, was ultimately brief. The Roman system, however wounded, survived his death and continued to function for centuries afterward. The precedents he established were dangerous, but they weren't fatal. Human societies have remarkable capacity for resilience, for adapting to new challenges while preserving essential functions. The senators who endured Caligula's humiliations learned to navigate a changed political environment without entirely abandoning their commitment to governance. They found ways to maintain dignity while accommodating imperial whims, to preserve institutional memory while adapting to new realities. Their flexibility, however psychologically costly, allowed the Roman system to survive its encounter with unprecedented challenges. This historical example suggests that modern democracies facing similar pressures might also find ways to adapt and survive. The specific techniques may be different, the institutional structures may have evolved, but the basic human capacity for resilience remains unchanged. Societies that have survived emperors who consulted horses about matters of life and death can probably weather whatever challenges contemporary politics might produce. The key insight from the Incitatus episode is that institutional survival depends less on formal structures than on the commitment of individuals to preserve essential functions despite changing circumstances. The Roman Senate survived. Caligula. Not because of its constitutional authority, which proved meaningless when confronted by unlimited imperial power, but because enough senators remained committed to the idea of governance, even when the forms of governance were being systematically degraded. This lesson applies beyond politics to any situation where institutional authority is challenged by individual power, whether in corporations, universities, religious organizations, or other complex social structures. The same dynamics play out repeatedly. Formal rules and traditional procedures provide some protection, but ultimate survival depends on human beings choosing to maintain essential functions even when those functions are being actively undermined. The horse that unwittingly participated in this historical transformation represents something larger than imperial excess or political dysfunction. Incitatus becomes a symbol of how individual relationships, even relationships with non-human entities, can become vehicles for expressing broader social and political tensions. Caligula's attachment to his horse wasn't really about the horse, any more than modern political controversies are really about their nominal subjects. Understanding this symbolic dimension helps explain why the story has retained such power across different historical periods.
Each generation sees in Caligula and his horse a reflection of their own concerns about leadership, authority, and the proper relationship between individual will and collective governance. The specific details change, but the underlying anxieties remain constant. The Roman Empire that emerged from Caligula's brief reign was fundamentally different from the one he had inherited, though the changes were often subtle and took decades to fully manifest. The psychological damage he inflicted on traditional institutions created vulnerabilities that would be exploited by future rulers, contributing to patterns of instability that would eventually prove fatal. But in the immediate aftermath of his assassination, Rome experienced something approaching relief. The nightmare was over. The horse would not become consul, and rational governance could resume. Claudius, despite his physical disabilities and scholarly temperament, proved to be a competent administrator who restored dignity to imperial office while respecting the traditional forms that Caligula had systematically degraded. The story of Incitatus thus becomes not just a tale of imperial excess, but a case study in how societies respond to and recover from traumatic political experiences. The damage was real and lasting, but it wasn't fatal. Human institutions, like human beings, possess remarkable capacity for healing and adaptation, for finding ways to preserve essential functions even under the most challenging circumstances. This resilience offers hope for modern societies facing their own versions of institutional challenge and political dysfunction.
Threats may be different, the technologies may have evolved, but the basic human capacity for survival and adaptation remains unchanged. If ancient Rome could survive an emperor who consulted his horse about matters of state, contemporary democracies can probably weather whatever storms they currently face. The final lesson of the Incitatus episode is that history's most significant changes often come not from grand proclamations or dramatic battles, but from seemingly absurd gestures that reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of authority itself. Sometimes it takes the threat of appointing a horse to high office to expose the fundamental weakness of the institutions we take for granted. Sometimes the most important political insights come wrapped in the most ridiculous packaging. As we continue to grapple with questions of leadership, authority, and institutional legitimacy in our own time, the story of Caligula and his beloved horse remains remarkably relevant, not because we face identical challenges, but because the underlying human dynamics remain unchanged. Power still corrupts, institutions still prove fragile, and individuals still must choose between dignity and survival when confronted by authority that has lost all connection to rational governance. The horse disappears from history, but the questions it raised about power, legitimacy, and the relationship between rulers and ruled continue to echo through the centuries. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for an animal that never understood the role it played in one of history's most significant political transformations.